Chapter 3 of Among the Forest People by Clara Dillingham Pierson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Claire. The Swaggering Crow. When the crows who have been away for the winter return to the forest, all their relatives gather on the treetops to welcome them and tell the news. Those who have been away have also much to say, and it sometimes seems as though they were all talking at once. They spend many days in visiting before they begin nest building. Perhaps if they would take turns and not interrupt each other, they would get the news more quickly, for when people are interrupted, they never can talk well. Sometimes, too, one hungry fellow will fly off for a few mouthfuls of grain, and get back just in time to hear the end of a story. Then he will want to hear the first part of it, and make such a fuss that they have to tell it all over again, just for him. At this time in the spring you can hear their chatter and laughter, even when you are far away, and the songbirds of the forest look at each other and say, "Dear me, the crows are back." They have very good reasons for disliking the crows, as any robin will tell you. There was one great shining black crow who had the loudest voice of all, and who was not at all afraid to use it. This spring he looked very lean and lank, for it had been a long cold winter, and he had found but little to eat, acorns, the seeds of the wild plants, and once in a great while a frozen apple that hung from its branch in some lonely orchard. He said that he felt as though he could reach around his body with one claw, and when a crow says that, he feels exceedingly thin. But now spring was here, and his sisters and his cousins and his aunts, yes, and his brothers and his uncles too, had returned to the forest to live. He had found 2 good dinners already, all that he could eat, and more too, and he began to feel happy and bold. The purple gloss on his feathers grew brighter every day, and he was glad to see this. He wanted to look so handsome that a certain Miss Crow, a sister of one of his friends, would like him better than she did any of the others. That was all very well if he had been at all polite about it, but one day he saw her visiting with another crow, and he lost his temper and flew at him, and pecked him about the head and shoulders, and tore the long 4th feather from one of his wings, besides rumpling the rest of his coat. Then he went away. He had beaten him by coming upon him from behind, like the sneak that he was, and he was afraid that if he waited he might yet get the drubbing he deserved. So he flew off to the top of a hemlock tree where the other crows were, and told them how he had fought and beaten. You should have seen him swagger around when he told it. Each time it was a bigger story, until at last he made them think that the other crow hadn't a tail feather left. The next day a number of crows went to a farm not far from the forest. Miss Crow was in the party. On their way they stopped in a field where there stood a figure of a man with a dreadful stick in his hand. Everybody was frightened except Mr. Crow. He wanted to show how much courage he had, so he flew right up to it. They all thought him very brave. They didn't know that down in his heart he was a great coward. He wasn't afraid of this figure because he knew all about it. He had seen it put up the day before, and he knew that there was no man under the big straw hat and the flapping coat. He knew that, instead of a thinking, breathing person, there was only a stick nailed to a pole. He knew that, instead of having 2 good legs with which to run, this figure had only the end of a pole stuck into the ground. Of course, he might have told them all, and then they could have gathered corn from the broken ground around, but he didn't want to do that. Instead, he said, "Do you see that terrible great creature with a stick in his hand? He is here just to drive us away, but he dares not touch me. He knows I would beat him if he did." Then he flew down and ate corn close beside the figure, while the other crows stood back and cawed with wonder. When he went back to them, he said to Miss Crow, "You see how brave I am. If I were taking care of anybody, nothing could ever harm her." And he looked tenderly at her with his little round eyes, but she pretended not to understand what he meant, for she did not wish to give up her pleasant life with the flock and begin nest building just yet. When they reached the barnyard there was a rich picking, and Mr. Crow made such a clatter that you would have thought he owned it all, and that the others were only his guests. He flew down on the fence beside a couple of harmless hens, and he flapped his wings and swaggered around until they began to sidle away. Then he grew bolder. You know bullies always do if they find that people are scared, and edged up to them until they fluttered off, squawking with alarm. Next he walked into the hen house, saying to the other crows, "You might have a good time too, if you were not such cowards." He had no more than gotten the words out of his bill when the door of the hen house blew shut and caught there. It was a grated door, and he scrambled wildly to get through the openings. While he was trying, he heard the hoarse voice of the crow whom he had beaten the day before, saying, "Thank you, we are having a fairly good time as it is." And he saw Miss Crow picking daintily at some corn which the speaker had scratched up for her. At that minute the great black Brahma cock came up behind Mr. Crow. He had heard from the Hens how rude Mr. Crow had been, and he thought that as the head of the house he ought to see about it. Well, one cannot say very much about what happened next, but the Black Brahma Cock did see about it quite thoroughly, and when the henhouse door swung open, it was a limp, ragged, and meek-looking Crow who came out, leaving many of his feathers inside. The next morning Mr. Crow flew over the forest and far away. He did not want to go back there again. He heard voices as he passed a tall tree by the edge of the forest. Miss Crow was out with the Crow whom he had beaten, and they were looking for a good place in which to build. "I don't think they will know me if they see me," said Mr. Crow, "and I am sure I don't want them to." End of chapter 3. Recording by Claire.